Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for Part 6 in our online Bible study of the book of Daniel. One good thing about being online is that all of our Bible studies and sermons are posted up there at borntowin.net. If you miss a Bible study or fall behind, no problem. All you have to do is click on the weekend Bible study link at borntowin.net, and all our Bible studies are archived up there. And let me tell you, there are some really great, in-depth Bible studies and sermons up there. Ron Dart's daily radio programs are up there too, in case the program isn't aired on a radio station near you. If you're not a regular listener to the Born to Win radio program, you're really missing out on some uniquely instructive presentations by Ron Dart. Ron's method of teaching the Bible and relating it to world events are always enriching and interesting, and they're never preachy, always instructive. Our website is a virtual treasure chest of inspirational and educational material, so be sure to do some serious exploring up there. Well, last week we finished chapter 1, which was more or less an introduction to Daniel and his three friends who had just been taken captive as hostages by Nebuchadnezzar. The chapter told us about their 3-year finishing school and introduced us to Ashpenaz, one of the king's chief officials who was in charge of the young men during their schooling. We saw Daniel and his friends were quite young, probably teenagers, but they were from the royal family, and they were very well educated, and they were refined and very handsome. They were being educated in Jerusalem to be put in positions of authority, and that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar was also expecting from them after he had educated them for 3 years. Verse 17 of Daniel 1 says, God gave them understanding and wisdom in all kinds of literature and learning, up and above their already high intellect and understanding. And to Daniel, God gave understanding and insight of all kinds of dreams and visions. Since they were born into royalty, it was expected of them to, from a very early age, that they should excel in everything they do. When we think about these 4 young men and consider how well their upbringing must have been, and we see how they conducted themselves with such godly character and impeccable morality, I think it's important to understand that their families and mentors had to have been exceptional people to be able to have produced such fine, upstanding young men. And this was during a time of moral decay and disobedience that had been going on to one extent or another for hundreds of years. So much so that God was finally fed up and decided to destroy them and send them into captivity. There must have been a good number of people, or at least some, who were living in Judea who continued to be obedient to God. Maybe these were the ones who survived the destruction and were allowed to live and eventually be taken to Babylon. We don't know for sure. Sadly, when national calamities occur for whatever reason, as a means of divine punishment, or if they just happen naturally, a lot of good people get hurt or displaced right along with those who might not be so good. And this is a sobering thing to consider. We see horrific things happening in our country for a host of different reasons: failed leadership, weak or corrupt religious leaders, rampant violence and unspeakable immorality, the murder of innocents, now totaling upwards of 55 million abortions, government intrusion and corruption of every kind, unconstitutional rule by executive order, and confiscatory taxation and regulations on every aspect of our lives. That just names a few of our problems. And now, most recently, the virtual eradication of our southern border. And why is all this happening? Well, because we've thumbed our nose at God. The enlightened elitists in academia and government have convinced many people that God is dead or irrelevant. They've basically told God to go to hell, and we can do this on our own. And so far, that's not working out too well, is it? As a country, We're replicating the sins and bad behavior of ancient Israel and Judah. But like in Daniel's Jerusalem, not everyone had forsaken God. There are still a lot of people in this country who earnestly seek God in regular prayer and fasting and Bible study, and maybe it's because of those 10, quote, righteous, end quote, in all our cities who are keeping us from complete collapse. You'll recall that God wasn't able to find 10 righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were subsequently destroyed. Anyway, let's venture on to chapter 2, Daniel 2 and verse 1. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar had these dreams in the second year of his reign, it says, according to verse 1. And this may seem to conflict with Daniel 1:5, where it says, in the last half of the verse, they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Well, these dreams happened after the 3-year training period, and this is now in their 4th year of captivity. Well, here's what's going on. And I mentioned this in a previous study, but when Nebuchadnezzar was at war with Egypt and then with Jerusalem at the first invasion, somewhere around 604 BC, he wasn't officially a king yet, although he was being called that. His ailing father, Nabopolassar, was still the official king, but he co-ruled with his son, Nebuchadnezzar, for 2 years or so. So most commentaries concur that this verse is referring to the second year of his official reign, having co-ruled for the first 2 years of Daniel's 3-year schooling. This seems to be the most logical explanation. One commentary put Nabopolassar's death on August 5th, 605 BC, which would be problematic to this time frame, but they also agreed that Nebuchadnezzar co-ruled for a couple of years prior to his official crowning. Discrepancies often arise because of inaccurate dates, and that's probably the case here. But the main thing to remember here is that Daniel saw no problem with the scenario he records, and he sees no reason to explain how this could be Nebuchadnezzar's second year instead of his 4th year. The second part of verse 1 says this: Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. Verse 2. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Now, in the next verse, verse 4, Daniel begins to write in the Aramaic language. He began writing this book in Hebrew, but he wrote in Aramaic all the way to chapter 7, and then he resumes writing in Hebrews after chapter 7. Bible commentator Cooper Abrams III has this to say about that. Quote, Daniel began writing this book in Hebrew, but in chapter 2, verse 4, it changes to Aramaic and continues in this language until chapter 7, where he returns to Hebrew. Aramaic was a language made up of a number of languages spoken in the Middle East. It was the common or international language of commerce, such as was Greek in the New Testament times, and as English today. Whitcomb, who is another commentator, explains that the King James Version translates the term Aramaic as Syriac, because the Greeks called the region of Aram by the name of Syria. Old Testament scholars used to call this language Chaldee because this passage says the Chaldeans are said to have spoken the language. And that's in chapter 2, verse 4. The reason could be that Daniel wanted the wise men of the king's court to be able to understand plainly that they and their false gods were being exposed and rebuked for their deceptive claims of having powers to interpret dreams and serve deities. Now let's move on to verse 4. Then the astrologers answered the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. The King James translates this verse this way, quote, Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, that is, Aramaic, O king, live forever, tell thy servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. Verse 5. The king replied to the astrologers, quote, This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was, and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces, and your houses turned into piles of rubble. Did you ever dream a dream you couldn't remember, no matter how hard you tried? It might even be a reoccurring dream, and in your dreamy state you say to yourself, I'm going to remember this dream this time. Then you wake up and sort of remember parts of it, and then it's gone. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me, and it's so frustrating. And maybe that's what's happening to the king here. Maybe he wasn't able to tell them the dream. And maybe that's why he's so insistent that they tell him what the dream was right now. And he wants to know what it means immediately. Verse 6. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. So it looks like it's either a gruesome death or great wealth, but they still need to know what the dream is. Verse 7. Once more they replied, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it. Then the king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. End quote. Verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. Daniel 2:11. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among the humans. End quote. Verse 12. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. Well, this was pretty rash. This doesn't seem to be a very well thought out decision because it affects way more people than are even involved here. Verse 13. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and the men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. So Daniel is completely out of the loop here. He doesn't even know what's going on, and he's on the list of those about to be killed. In the next few verses, notice how calm Daniel is compared with the king who's acting completely irrational. Verse 14. When Arioch, the commander of the king's court, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, Why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Daniel's calm demeanor and dignity must have had a soothing effect on the king because he's agreeable to give Daniel some time. Whereas prior to this, he's about to go on a killing spree with all the wise men. The Barnes commentary suggests the executions may have already begun when they started looking for Daniel in order to execute him. Keep in mind that Daniel and his friends are still really young. It hadn't been all that long since their graduation, and at this point, standing before the king, Daniel had no idea what the dream was or what it meant. And he would have to convey that to the king. Yet Daniel's tact and wisdom and communication skills enabled him to convince the king to let them have a little bit more time. Let's take a short break before going on, and we'll be right back.
Never before have children been in so much danger. Danger from sex, drugs, alcohol, guns, even from their own family. What can you do about it? Write or call and ask for a free CD titled Save Your Children and find out. Write to Born to Win, Post Office Box 560, White House, Texas 75791. Or call toll-free 1-888-BIBLE-44.
Thanks, Gary. Be sure to call or write for the information Gary talks about in these breaks. They're free, of course, and it's always good listening or reading, regardless of what he's offering. Okay, so Daniel was able to buy some time with the king, but the king is still impatient, so they don't have much time. Of all the things these young men had experienced in the last 4 years, nothing like this had ever presented itself. Oh, they were familiar with being tested, and they did well in all their past tests, but this was a little different. It presented a new challenge. The source for the answers would be the same. They always sought God with their whole heart, and this was just another opportunity to do that. They didn't know what God had in mind for them. They didn't know if this was the beginning of the end or just what was going on. They did know that if God didn't help them with this dream, their lives would be over. Life was cheap to heathen kings. Daniel must have hurried home to be able to engage his 3 friends in deep prayer that probably lasted well into the night, if not all night. Verse 17. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men in Babylon. These 4 young men knew well that God could reveal this dream and its meaning to them, but they also knew it was up to God. God could save their lives, but would he? They turned it over to God, and surely they must have mused and meditated about what their former teachers and prophets would have counseled them. Maybe they remembered the words of their friend Jeremiah when he said this about God, quote, "Call to me, and I will answer you, and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." End quote. And that's found in Jeremiah 33, verse 3. And though it hadn't been written yet, they were fully aware of the fact that James referred to in James 5:16, quote, "The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." End quote. Now, verse 19. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. I don't think Daniel got any sleep that night. If Daniel would have been sleeping, more than likely God would have revealed the answer in a dream. But it says he had a vision. The last part of verse 19 says, "Then Daniel praised the God of heaven." And notice his exuberance and how he lavishes praise on God before he even gets to the thank yous. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you, and you have made known to us the dream of the king." End quote. The vision was given to Daniel, but here in verse 23, he includes his friends because this was a group effort of intense prayers that stirred God to show Daniel the vision. Throughout this book, God communicates to Daniel and others by way of dreams, visions, and later on in the book, he sends Gabriel. We're all familiar with this vision that Daniel saw, but just think what it must have been like for Daniel to literally experience that vision. It would have been much more vivid and memorable than a dream, and when he was witnessing it, he must have realized he was the first person in the world to see unfolding right in front of him the present and future world ruling empires that would take us right up to the return of Jesus Christ. And he saw that God was actively involved in the affairs of man, setting up kings and kingdoms and tearing them down according to his will. And he saw and shared with his prayer warrior friends that God was actively involved in their lives too. It must have dawned on Daniel and his friends that God was using them to be shining lights and preserving salt to the king and the court of this first golden empire. They had every reason to be ecstatic and exuberant in their praise for God. Not only would their lives be spared, but they may have now gotten a glimpse of what God's purpose was for them. Verse 24. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. End quote. At this point, Daniel is in full command of the situation, and he's in a strong position because of what he knows. Like someone said, knowledge is power. That's not to say he suddenly is overcome with megalomania. He's still the humble and obedient servant of God he always has been. It's just that now he's filled with the confidence and assurance of God's full support. So he tells Arioch to stop the executions because he has the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now the next verse gives us a glimpse into Arioch's character. He's hoping to cash in on this situation by suggesting to the king that it was he who was the one who found the person that was able to explain the dream. Verse 24. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. End quote. Verse 26. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. Well, this negative reply to the king's question probably raised the king's blood pressure a little, and surely would have put him back into a rage, but for the next part of Daniel's answer. Verse 28. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. In the last two verses, Daniel is sort of defending all of the enchanters and magicians, while at the same time he's taking the opportunity to show everyone that their earthly gods are completely incapable of performing the miracles that only the one true God of the universe can perform. Daniel is quick to give God credit for this revelation, and the explanation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream amounts to the glorification and witnessing of God before the most powerful man on earth at that time. Verse 29. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Now, verse 31 begins the interpretation of the dream. Verse 31, Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So that was the dream. Nebuchadnezzar has to be reassured at this point that Daniel knows what he's talking about, but he still doesn't know what the dream means. Verse 36, "This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king." Verse 37, "Your Majesty, you are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth." Verse 40, "Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle." Verse 43, "And just as you saw iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay." Verse 44, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." 45. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. End quote. So that's the interpretation of the dream, and it surely must have spawned many questions from the king, just as the reader of this chapter will have questions. Bible readers and prophecy aficionados have heard the meaning of this dream and the symbolism of that statue over and over for years. At the time of this dream and Daniel's interpretation, the identity of the subsequent empires wouldn't have been known. But all but the last two empires have come and gone, so we know who they were. History has been able to identify who followed after the fall of the Babylonian Empire. But the empire symbolized by the toes of clay and iron hasn't yet come on the scene. Verse 46, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate on the floor before Daniel, and paid him honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him." 47, "The king said to Daniel, 'Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery.'" End quote. Verse 48, "Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all of its wise men." So Nebuchadnezzar kept his promise when he said in verse 6 he would grant gifts and rewards and high honors to the man who could interpret this dream. Verse 49, "Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court." Daniel and his friends may have only been 18 or 19 years old when all this happened, and yet they were given these positions in the king's hierarchy. God was working with them, all right, and they were being blessed for their faithfulness and loyalty to God, even while being completely immersed in the seat of power and luxury in Babylon. Next week, we'll spend a little more time on the meaning of that dream and the empires that were represented in that immense statue. So please join us as we explore the rest of the book of Daniel. Thank you for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you online next week. Good night, everyone.